What's up, everyone? Welcome to the first installment of our Trndsttrs show. If you've been around the interwebs, you may have seen my face or some of our incredible team members' faces. Face-I, is that the plural of face? I'm not entirely sure. I myself have made tons of videos over the years, and consistently what I've been thinking about is how do we make that a little bit more systematic? How do we do that more consistent? And how do we create conversations that I might have with some of our team members here, or that I might have with a client or a prospect, or a lot of these things that I can try to script within a video production, but ultimately they come out best on the fly. So today is April 20th, 2020. For those that don't know, that is 420. I don't know the origins of 420 and why it is this day. But for the 3 people in the planet that don't know what 420 means, that is referencing cannabis. Yes, now you're listening. So essentially, it is National Cannabis Day, you could say. Also National Cold Brew Day, which is wildly interesting with whoever defined both of those. And so today we're going to be diving into both of those topics very in depth regarding specifically Gen Z's stance on them, as well as some interesting insights that we have done ourselves. But before, I want to preface it with this. I despise national holidays. I think national holidays are idiotic. I think they're stupid. And from a marketing perspective, there's nothing I hate more outside of hashtag Motivation Monday, which is something I also hate, than when companies feel that they need to support specific holidays and make the classic Happy 4th of July post. Thank you, random local company that I don't care about and has no brand authority to reference 4th of July. So this will probably be the first and only time I ever talk about national holidays. But I had a good excuse. This cold brew and cannabis, one of which is one of my favorite things. The other is a interesting thing. I'll let you decide which you think is which. So to start with cannabis, weed, marijuana, Mary Jane, the devil's lettuce, whatever you want to call it, bud, whatever you want to call it, there's no denying that it has created incredible business opportunities. It has also raised quite a bit of concern, not just from a legal perspective, but also from a business and employer perspective. So I'm going to be diving into quite a few topics here, but the first one I wanted to start with was the differences between alcohol and cannabis. And not from a scientific perspective, because I am in no way qualified, but a marketing one. And so what's been interesting around the studies that we have seen, as well as the studies that we have launched, is Gen Z's preference for cannabis pretty much instead of alcohol. Now, this is wildly interesting because when you think about coffee, when you think about alcohol, and when you think about cannabis, these are all consumer products that are technically drugs. Coffee, caffeine, alcohol, obviously alcohol, right? And cannabis, obviously, marijuana. So, and whatever the compounds in it that make it like the drug part. So, THC, there we go. So regardless, you get the point. And how we build those in and when those moments happen are unique. So when are you consistently consuming coffee? Likely at your job, likely, during work, likely first thing in the morning to get kind of woken up, maybe take some pre-workout as well, maybe a Bang energy or two. But that's your typical preference for consuming caffeine. Now, what about alcohol? You're typically not waking up in the morning and immediately consuming alcohol. If that is the case, you're probably watching a different series right now. So assuming that we don't have any alcoholics here, likely you're consuming alcohol, maybe at night. Maybe you have like a glass of wine or a beer or just a little drink or whatever. Or it's going out with friends, or it's at like events, or it's celebration. But it's all some of those positive or relaxing moments. And so that's kind of your moment with alcohol. Now you think about cannabis and where that fits in. And what you quickly realize with cannabis is that it takes on a much larger spectrum of potential consumer plays. Is cannabis consumed first thing in the morning to wake you up? by some individuals? Yes. Is it also used, late at night to help you sleep? Also yes. Is it used socially with friends? Yes. Is it used, before you're gonna go watch a movie or something of that nature, or go do something to relieve anxiety? Yes. So as you can see, it fits into a lot more categories. And what that means is that it can sell in a lot different areas. And when it does, it's likely taking away from some of our other players, particularly alcohol. So something we've seen with Gen Z specifically is their preference for cannabis versus alcohol. And so perhaps what we see in the future, we've already seen a decline in particularly beer sales. That was mainly led by millennials. Now we've seen this big White Claw, truly sparkling beverage pandemic, you could say, paired a little bit before the coronavirus, right? That's coming in and wiping out a lot of beer brands and a lot of hard alcohol brands as well. So it's been interesting to see that. Now you have cannabis that is continuing to enter the market. And what does that do for bars? Bars become a lot less frequent because Gen Z is less of a go out and drink with friends and more of a stay at home, play games, chill, relax, get high. So those kind of consumer behaviors that are going to play out are going to drastically change things for today's brands. And then it brings up the question of how ultimately do you shift? How do you shift to potentially fit that? Are the bars of the future ones that sell both alcohol and cannabis? And there's consumption mediums for both. If so, what does that change the style of a bar? Alcohol may be more of a conversational drug, whereas cannabis might be a more kind of relaxing, chill, so you create the environment accordingly. So these are all things to take into consideration as we see this rise in cannabis from a brand perspective. The next is also determining what your brand's stance on cannabis is going to be. Let's pretend there's legalization in every state, which seems inevitable at this point as we approach this conversation. But let's say, speaking of, let's say I am a Fortune 500 consumer-facing brand, and we're running this ad campaign. And obviously, we don't directly sell cannabis. But do we have the brand authority to mention cannabis in an ad campaign? Let's say, I am particularly a food company. Can I run a campaign, around munchies or around late night snacks? And if so, what does that look like? And how obvious am I with the whole cannabis play, or how subtle am I? So those are all things to take into consideration from a brand perspective, even outside of cannabis. Cannabis is ultimately going to create opportunities not just for those businesses within cannabis, but also ones that are around it as well. So it'll be interesting to see that shift. The next question I have is for employers, and particularly how you shift employment with cannabis consumption being a lot more regular. What happens to drug testing, for instance? What happens when employees are potentially getting high during lunch, during their smoke break, during or even before work, or even after work, but on work premises? How do you combat those solutions? And there's going to be a lot of gray area for the near future. What I think this ties into most from an employer perspective is ultimately a generational gap. The majority of the data we see, which certainly there's outliers on both sides, when we look at Gen Z, they are much more open, they are much more supportive when it comes to cannabis. And even if they don't consume it regularly, they are still in support of it, and they're still totally okay with it. It's not going to bother them. However, when you look at the other end of the spectrum with boomers, Gen X, even the higher end of millennials, their stances on it are somewhat negative. And maybe this was like a Reagan era thing or something that has just stemmed from generations, but they might see the drug as the devil or the worst thing to happen ever. And so because they have that perception of it, it makes solving these problems much more difficult. So something that we need to do as employers is proactively develop a plan and a stance when it comes to cannabis and how we are going to deal with that. Because look, here's the reality. Your employees that are younger, particularly in Gen Z, are likely not gonna stop consuming cannabis just on the off chance that you drug test them just so they can have that job. They're likely just gonna go somewhere else. And so perhaps from a recruiting and talent acquisition standpoint, that potentially makes things more difficult. And if so, what do drug tests shift to look like? So there's a lot of question marks there. There's also a lot of question marks when it comes to daily usage of cannabis. Now, I referenced coffee earlier, so I want to bring us back to that. Every single morning, you're likely consuming 1 to 3 cups of coffee if you're a normal human being. If you're myself, you're closer to 5 or 6. And as we're consuming that, we really don't think anything of it. But at the end of the day, you are consuming a drug. That drug is impacting your performance positively. And so the question that stems for that is for cannabis users that maybe can consume cannabis and still be able to work regularly, which I have encountered individuals that actually perform better when they are high or when they've consumed cannabis. You know, what's the difference between that and cannabis? And how do we navigate those kind of uncharted waters? And what does that look like? And can you be high while at work if it is discreet and not as known, if it improves your performance? And you know, what does that look like in terms of roles? And why can this person be high, but this person can't be? So I think these are all very important questions that we need to be asking from an employer that are going to create ridiculously large problems in the future that if we can proactively get ahead of, it will create a lot of potential positives in the firm if we can actually get ahead of these and create solutions accordingly. So my big takeaway when it comes to cannabis is that the opportunities are huge from a business perspective, and it's vital that we as employers or as leaders or even as Gen Z continue to stay open-minded and proactive when it comes to the usage of cannabis. The next topic I want to dive into is cold brew coffee. I know today's episode is very much consumer products focused, but these are two wildly interesting topics. And when it comes to cold brew, the biggest question that I've seen from advertisers, brands, marketers, really anyone within business is the question of, is cold brew the future of coffee as we know it? Or is this just merely a fad that's going to fade away? And I think we can look to, Truly and White Claw and some of the other winners in that space to see, I know in the past it did come up as a fad, or likely it popped up here and there, but didn't last. But now it's clearly looking like the future of the industry. And we're seeing something similar with cold brew. And oddly enough, we've actually conducted a specific study around cold brew. And so I wanted to share some of the insights with you that I have just kind of off the top of the noggin here and written down. So the first was that the hot versus cold preference for Gen Z consumers in specific was an exact 50-50 split. So we asked Gen Z consumers if they preferred to consume, obviously hot coffee or cold coffee and why. And it was a 50-50 split on a decent sized target audience. So that was wildly interesting because I think there's a lot of pros and cons for both that I think would be interesting to dive into. For one, I think hot coffee has distinguished itself as the routine winner. You're used to getting up in the morning and drinking hot coffee. I think that warm beverage is soothing potentially to your throat, particularly in the morning, or it kind of warms you up because I don't know if it's just myself, but I feel like I wake up and I'm always like cold. And then as the day progresses, I by the end of the day, I'm like ridiculously, I'm pretty much sweating, right? So maybe it's a little bit of that routine. But cold brew, on the other hand, is a lot more convenient, right? Like you can pick it up actually in retail. You don't have to drink it within 30 minutes. Probably once a day, I will actually make myself a cup of coffee, and before I know it, it's been an hour and I haven't even had a sip and it's freezing cold now. So I don't really love those moments, and I'm gonna go reheat it in the microwave that I almost rip the door off every time. So it's interesting, but another kind of pro, particularly for hot coffee is the mixability. You know, you can turn that into lattes, you can turn it into cappuccinos, mochas. Is that coffee terms? I don't really know the difference. I always just get coffee black, but you can turn it into a lot of those other things. You can do the same with cold brew, obviously, but it's not necessarily like you're adding it on top. Like you wouldn't necessarily add your own creamer into a cold brew. Cold brew is typically coming just in a more standardized element, but you know, there's obviously more frozen options as well. So that's kind of my stance on cold brew, some of the pros and cons of hot versus cold. I think what's also interesting to take into account here is seasonality. So obviously it's middle April right now. Truly, I think we're gonna have kind of a delayed summer sales-wise for consumers. I think there's no denying that. So we're probably not seeing the cold brew sales that we would normally see this time of year. But I think as the temperature warms up, cold brew sales tend to spike. And obviously, inversely, when the weather gets a little bit colder, hot coffee is gonna prevail a little bit higher. So I think it's interesting to take into account and into consideration is what does that look like in wintertime? What does that look like in summertime? And then particularly in spring and fall, what does that look like? But I think there's no denying that cold brew, in my particular opinion and stance and some of the data I've seen, is not a fad. This is the future of the industry. This is where things are moving. It's much easier to actually consume. And I think we're seeing a shift that is certainly here to stay. And it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the years. So next topic I'm gonna dive into is responding to some LinkedIn comments. So I asked people to go ahead and leave some comments for me, thus that I could answer them live. So we're gonna go over some of those questions right now. I got the LinkedIn pulled up. If you don't already have me on LinkedIn, go find me. My name is Jake Bjorseth. It's like pretty much the only one. If you figure out the spelling of the last name, you should be good. Haven't found another Jake Bjorseth, but I've been trying. So, question from Bryce Adams, who is the quote-unquote coffee guy on LinkedIn. Do you drink regular cold brew or only nitro? Do you feel there is a brand of cold brew that actually resonates with you or just convenience buying? So to answer the first question, I do drink just regular cold brew. I have had nitro here and there, but nitro is a little bit too intense for me in terms of the caffeine. Next, do you feel there is a brand that resonates with me? Okay, so I mentioned this on a podcast with Carson last week. Go check out the podcast if you haven't already. And here's the reality. I hate my answer for this. I'm not proud of it. It's not my fault, but it's Starbucks. Starbucks has by far and beyond the best cold brew. And if you disagree with me, you're fired. You're hired and you're fired. Look, I've been mentioning this quite often. If a local company, I'm looking at you, can just create a cold brew that is dark and comes through looking like Starbucks and tastes like it, I will buy a ridiculous amount of cold brew from you and get me on a subscription. I don't care how much it is. I will get it for the team every single day because that's how much of a fan of cold brew I am. I've never seen it done well, and here's how you know. If it comes out and it looks like they just made you sweet tea because it's brown, that's a bad start for cold brew. You need that Starbucks pitch black as night coffee. That's what I'm looking for in my cold brew. So sadly, Bryce, I am a Starbucks fan for nothing else outside of cold brew. Also, quick hack for everyone. Refills are 50 cents on cold brew. Don't let them know I told you that. Managers will literally not know that, and you'll have to correct them, but I promise you that is my insider info. Question from David Melamed. I hope I pronounced that right. How cannabis and cold brew helps Gen Z self-medicate away from murdering the millennials living in their neighbor's basement. Uppers and downers was the title of that. Okay, so kind of the combination of the two. Interesting. So I have not seen a lot of data and insight around cannabis plus cold brew or combining uppers and downers together. I'd have to do more research on that. I don't know about that from a productivity standpoint. I personally can't do that. I will rarely actually consume cannabis, and if so, I'm pretty much out. Like, I'm not gonna be able to have a conversation. So I prefer to keep moving fast. So yeah, I don't know, David, I'm sorry. The next question, what platform will you be using to release the first episode? Will it be LinkedIn? That's from my boy Cody Bash. Yes, it will be LinkedIn. I think we're gonna try to find a live version of this at some point, host that somewhere, although I'm pretty anti-live video because I'm like, who's gonna waste their time talking or listening to me talk? So I don't know, we'll see. But the main purpose of this is to post. I think we'll post to YouTube, we'll post to LinkedIn, obviously a lot of these clips. We'll post to our podcast as well, so those will be like the long form. So yeah, I mean, we're gonna post this everywhere: Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. Where can we find the podcast? You can find that on pretty much every podcast platform. So on your phone, there's Apple Podcasts, there's also Spotify Podcasts. Pretty much whatever you use, you're gonna be able to find us on, and it is literally just called Trndsttrs, with no vowels, of course. Next question I have is my question for you and your team. How important do you think influencer strategy is for these type of products or these type of brands, given that they are usually B2C products? Okay, so in terms of influencer marketing, I'm confident that it is vital to new consumer brands and products. And if I were to start a consumer brand from the ground up, I would be 100% focused on influencer marketing with my budget. The primary reason being, what we need to do is get consistent customers quickly. I also try to get them on monthly subscriptions or some sort of consistent revenue line, or at least make sure I'm making the most of my existing customers. However, when it goes about acquiring customers, what I'd be looking for is influencers, because the reality is this: your brand's not gonna be known. No one's gonna know who you are. No one's gonna have a reason to trust your products. Everyone says they're the most trustworthy in quality and their reasoning as to why. Everyone says it, so thus no one believes it. So if I were to launch, a consumer-facing B2C product, I would be solely focused on influencer marketing. I think it's the best channel. Within influencer marketing, I would be thinking about micro-influencer marketing. I'd also be really thinking about my strategy, less of a transactional one and more of a buy-in. And when I say buy-in, I want to be very clear with this. Stop sending influencers free shit and asking them to promote your stuff. That is not a long-term viable strategy, to send people free things in order to promote it. And can we stop this ambassador code thing? Apply to be an ambassador and you get 25% off and you make 15% and all this stuff. Like, look, I get it and the economics make sense, but every time those go out, you're actually just harming your brand. So I get the economics behind it, but there's much better ways to do it that are gonna yield greater ROI. So instead, what I'd be thinking about is revenue share. I'd be thinking about custom product lines. Let's say I'm on Cannabis, right? I would go to every major music artist, or the ones that probably don't own their own cannabis lines. I would go to all of them and let them create their own cannabis line, strain, you call it, that is theirs, and they own royalties on that forever. And so thus they are always incentivized to promote that. And guess what? If they promote it, awesome. Even if they don't promote it, what are you getting? You're getting that brand name, that reputation, and the fact that you're working with a well-known music artist, now you have a lot more consumer trust. So that's what I personally would be thinking about. If I were to work in micro influencer marketing, with some other products, I'd be thinking about a coordinated micro influencer campaign. So what I mean by that is, think like Fire Festival, but with smaller individuals at a massive scale. I'd be thinking about, instead of how I can get a few influencers and get to 1 million impressions, how can I get 1,000 micro influencers, each with their own network of 1,000, because the economics on that make a lot more sense, and it's gonna have a lot greater impact in terms of actual conversions there. Then they're bought into the brand. You can just do a lot more interesting, valuable things. So that's my approach to influencer marketing. But having an actual influencer strategy and not just outsourcing it to an agency that does influencer transactions for you all day is gonna be vital. And I see very few companies doing this particularly well. All right, everyone, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for tuning in. I have some closing remarks here and then we'll get out of here. The first is that weed is dope, but it's also disruptive. You need to ensure that you make it work, you remain open-minded, and you take proactive approaches to the inevitable widespread usage of cannabis from both a brand and employer perspective. The second, cold brew, it tastes goddamn delicious. It is not a fad, and this is gonna spill over, ironically, into some other industries. And what I mean by that is, what's gonna happen to your massive Keurig machine, your coffee pot, what happens, is cold brew kegs the new norm? There's a lot of question marks around there, so we shall see. And finally, my last take is that your influencer marketing strategy is entirely flawed. You need to fix it, and whether you're in B2C, B2B, I don't care the market, you need to have a clear influencer strategy and start engaging influencers today while the cost is still ridiculously low. Thank you all for tuning in. It is 4:20, so I'm gonna get out of here, not to go consume cannabis, but to go consume cold brew because it's National Cold Brew Day, which, spoiler, is my favorite. I don't regularly consume cannabis, but if people want to, by all means. So thank you so much for tuning in. Go like all of our shit on socials. Go check out, give us a rating on the podcast. Go like our YouTube. I don't know, just help us out, hook us up, and inform more individuals about all the trend-setting news they need to know. Thanks.